Hello and welcome to another lecture. This time we're taking a closer look on the classic bishop sacrifice on h7. So the question is this move a really good move or a really bad move? And there are a few factors we have to consider while taking in consideration. First, which white pieces are going to favor taking on h7? You can pause the video at all times. Well, first of all, the rook on h1 is kind of good because it looks to h7. But then we also have a pawn on h4, which is significant. Of course, on h2, it would be much harder for the rook to gain control over the h-file. And also a white knight that can go to g5, followed by a queen that can lead up to h5 and h7 following. But you shouldn't forget about the 5 pawn that prevents the black knight from going to f6 and controlling the h7 pawn, but also the h5 square, and in general protecting the king. So the knight on d5 from black is kind of misplaced, but also the rook on f8 because it prevents black from escaping in the middle. So these are all factors that might favor taking on h7. But just take a closer look if it really is a good move. So we try to take it. Usually we just think about like taking the bishop, because if we play something like king h8, it's not really going to be a challenging answer. We can just simply play something like knight g5, queen h5, and we are going to win quite easily. So bishop h7, king takes h7, and what is the next white move? It's going to be knight g5 check, of course. Now black has several options: king g8, king g6, king h6, and king h8. What move do you think is the best? Well, before we come to that, we're going to take a look at the worst moves, which are king h8 and king h6. For example, king h6. Then we can simply take on f7, giving a double check to the king, and at the same time getting a fork on the queen. So king h7, for example, we can give a check and afterwards take the queen and have a winning position. For example, something like king h8, then here is checkmate in 2 moves. Can you find it? White can play queen h5, king g8, and queen h7 checkmate. So king moves on the h-file are going to be very bad, so we look at king g8. Then our next move is going to be clear as well. We have to play queen to h5 to threaten checkmate. And here you see again why the rook on f8 is so bad, because it can only go to e8 and we can simply checkmate our opponent in 2 moves. And if there wasn't a bishop on e7, he could escape, but now he can't, so it's going to be a loss for black. So rook e8 is of course the worst move in this position. Black has to play bishop takes g5 to prevent getting mated. And now white can take, of course, with the pawn, opening up the h-file for the rook on h1 and threatening checkmate. And now rook e8, for example, doesn't work because of queen h8, so there is no escape, and we have to play f6 to make a tiny space for our king as black. So if queen h7, for example, king f7 would be a rescue in the last minute, but f6 giving white the opportunity to play g6 and having like a Damiano pawn, so having control over f7 and h7, and now checkmate cannot be prevented anymore, and it's going to be made quite soon. So also king g8 is going to be lost quite soon. So last move of the king moves we have to consider is king g6. And now here is a beautiful move, which is queen g4, threatening something like knight to e6 with checks that are very dangerous. And black has to play something like f5 to attack the queen and prevent white from getting these checks. And here we can actually play e takes f6, but it's not going to be very good because of something like check, of course, and afterwards the king can take on f6 and walk to e7, and that's not going to be very profitable for white. A better move here in this position is h5. Black king has to go to h6, and now we can actually win very easily with the move knight to e6 or knight to f7. You can basically choose knight to f7, for example, king h7, queen to g6, king g8, and something like knight takes the queen, followed by h6, and this is going to be an easy win for white. And last move in this line we have to consider is, of course, the bishop taking the knight on g5, and if taken back by the pawn, king g8 is of course the same line we have looked earlier, queen to h5, and something like f6, we play g6. And after king g6, there's going to be an interesting combination which is made in 3 moves. Can you find the checkmate? Well, the first move, of course, is going to be queen to h5, and we have to force our opponent's king in the open field, king f5, and now something like g6 is a possible move, but after king e4, we are not going to be mating our opponent in one move, because the opponent can walk to d4, and we cannot check and protect d4 at the same time. So g6 is not the right move, but queen to h3. Now black has 2 options, to go back to g6 or to go in the center. If he goes back to g6, we now can play queen to h7, checkmate. And if he goes to e4, we can play queen to d3, protecting d4 and at the same time checkmating our opponent. So we now have looked at every line that you have to consider before taking on h7, and that's really important because in the game you have to do all those calculations in your head right before you make the move bishop takes h7, but this position is just a very good example on how it actually can work, because you have so many good factors. You have a beautiful rook on h1, you have a pawn on h4 which is very strong, you have a misplaced knight on d5 because of the strong e5 pawn of white, and a knight on f3 that can walk to g5, so everything is perfect here for white. It's very a role model of a classic bishop sacrifice on h7. And we now take a closer look at a different example where it's not as easy anymore. Alright, classic bishop sacrifice on h7 number 2. So here we can also see some similarities and some differences. We have the strong bishop on d3 that wants to sacrifice himself on h7. We have the strong knight on g5. We have the strong queen that wants to follow on h5 and h7. And again, a strong pawn on e5 that has led to a misplaced knight on e8. And again, like a very bad rook on f8. But we don't have a rook on h1 and don't have a pawn on h4 that can also boost our attack. So often not all benefits are given in the games, but nevertheless an attack can also work without all these factors. So let's look at bishop takes h7. Again, king takes, and knight g5 is the logical move that follows. Now we have to take into consideration the moves king g8 and king g6. The moves on the h-file are going to be very bad because of similar reasons like in the first role model game. Starting with king g8. Now we have to be kind of careful. We cannot play something like queen h5 because of the move bishop f5 and h7 is well protected, so we have to play a little bit differently. Can you guess the correct move? It is queen to e4. Of course, now we actually protect the square on f5 and also threaten checkmate. And the knight on e8 cannot do anything because of the strong pawn on e5. But black now has a different sort of defense, which is g6, blocking the diagonal. But this time we can actually play queen to h4 because now the bishop on f5 cannot protect h7 anymore because of the bad pawn on g6. So after queen to h4, checkmate cannot be prevented anymore. That's the reason why king g8 is actually quite bad, and king g6 is oftentimes a very challenging move and we have to play very carefully to actually win this time. And now it's your turn again. What move would you suggest as a white? The move I would play is again queen to e4, checking, and after something like bishop to f5, I would play again queen to h4, threatening checkmate from the back, and it's kind of hard for black to do something against it, maybe something like rook to h8, but now we can take the rook, and even if we don't checkmate our opponent, we will have a massive material advantage, and this will be enough. Maybe something like knight to f6 to prevent white from playing queen to h7, and now we can maybe even just trade the queens and have like a solid rook advantage. That's quite enough. But again, our opponent doesn't have to play bishop to f5. He also can play pawn to f5, which is a little bit different, because now after queen to h4, knight f6 is going to come. And if we take, he now can play rook h8 quite easily because the queen is protecting the rook. And we have to go back. But now Black has survived, but his king is very, very weak, and we can actually attack him with this beautiful move, knight to e4. Of course, the knight is sacrificing himself, but giving away the square so that the bishop can enter and make a pin on the queen, and can make a skewer on the king and the queen. Something like takes, of course, the move bishop g5, and if something like king to f7, knight to d6, and now the end is very near, king to f8, queen to g6, and now we either checkmate on f7 or on e8. So we didn't win immediately, but it just was a matter of time until we got our full point from the sacrifice on h7. Alright, that was our second example and the end of our lecture concerning the classic bishop sacrifice on h7. Again, I think it's a very valuable idea in the middle game that you have to know, because it sometimes has to be a way on how to win the game very effectively, very easily, and it's very good to know this idea right away before you get to know more complex structures. Alright, I hope you learned something. See you in the next lecture. Bye bye.